Hello, this is UkrLife with Lyudmila Nemiri, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy that our guest today is Robert Leigh Turner. He is a writer and British former diplomat, and he was a British ambassador to Ukraine from 2008 till 2012. Mr. Turner, hello, and thank you so much to be with us today.
It's wonderful to be with you and great to be speaking to you there in Kiev.
Thank you. Mr. Turner, I know that last year in 2023, your book, Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties, was published in Germany. And I know that English version of this book will be published in autumn this year. And I think it is very important because I read many very good words about your book, and I know that part of this book is about Ukraine as well. Let's speak a little bit about this book at the beginning.
Great, thank you very much for mentioning that. Yes, I retired in 2021 after 42 years as a British diplomat, including a very wonderful and important for me 4 years in Ukraine as ambassador in Kiev in 2008 to 2012. And before that, interestingly, I was also posted in Moscow in the years 1992 to 1995 as First Secretary Economic. So those two countries have had a big impact on my life and on my career. And when I came to retire in 2021, I was invited by an Austrian publisher to write a book, which was then called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Diplomacy, about what lessons everybody could draw from diplomacy, both diplomats and people who aren't diplomats. Is diplomacy still relevant? What can we learn from it? And that book was originally published in German last year, called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Diplomacy. And now, as you say, it's coming out in September in English. Now it's called Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics, Power and Parties. And a great deal of the book is about Ukraine and Russia and the relationship between them. How is it that we've come to this appalling war, which began in 2014 and became even worse in 2022 with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine? How should other countries be responding to it? Why does it matter to all of us? And what can we do about it? So I address those questions in some detail, including my experiences as a young diplomat in Moscow and also my experiences as ambassador in Ukraine, what we learned from that, including, for example, my visit to Moscow in 2009, when I went to see the head of the Ukraine section in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to talk about Ukraine and how Russia saw it. And I remember on that occasion discussing Ukraine's ambitions to become closer to the European Union. And I asked the gentleman, how do you feel about that? You know, I know that you would rather that Ukraine would join the customs union, but is it any problem that Ukraine is getting closer to the European Union? And the head of Russia's Ukraine section in the foreign ministry in 2009 said to me, no, that's fine. I mean, it's up to Ukraine. Of course, we'd like them to join our customs union, but if they want to do something else, that's up to them. And these are very important lessons and very important messages because, of course, since 2014, Russia has been inventing dozens of different reasons why it had to attack Ukraine. And most of them are, of course, nonsense, including the argument that in some way it was the fault of the European Union that Russia had to attack Ukraine.
Sure. If we go back to the lessons in diplomacy, and for you, huge, many years experience in diplomacy, do you expect it that such big war, such big Russian war against Ukraine will be possible? I expected this.
I think when I arrived in Kiev in 2008, it was just the time of the Russia-Georgia war in 2008. So we saw the possibility of an attack from that time. We had seen Ukraine seeking to join NATO in 2008 under President Yushchenko, and some countries in NATO, such as the United Kingdom and the United States, thought that it would give Ukraine important security guarantees if it could start the process of joining NATO in 2008. But some other countries, notably France and Germany, argued that it would be too risky for Ukraine to join NATO and that that could provoke Russia. Now, those arguments weren't stupid arguments. It was a reasonable thing for Germany and France to believe that. In fact, with hindsight, we can see that Russia attacked Ukraine anyway, even without Ukraine being able to join NATO or begin the process of NATO accession. So perhaps with hindsight, we should have let Ukraine join NATO back in 2008. But already then, in 2008, after we saw the Russia-Georgia war in 2008, we could see there was a risk that Russia would go further one day, in particular in Crimea. Russia was often making statements about Crimea. And at that time, when I was ambassador from 2008 to 2012, we sought to get more investment in Crimea, both from the UK, United Kingdom, and from the European Union, in order to stimulate economic development in Crimea, in the hope that that would increase the desire of people in Crimea to remain as part of Ukraine. And of course, back in 2010, we saw the elections which took place in Ukraine, and those included elections in Crimea. And there was a pro-Russian unity party, was a candidate in those 2010 elections in Crimea, led by Sergei Aksyonov, who was appointed so-called prime minister by Russia after 2014. And in those 2010 elections, there was a hard core of people in Crimea who wanted to be part of Russia and who voted for that Russian unity party. And we know how many of them there were. There were 4% of people in Crimea were kind of strongly pro-Russian. But actually, it was other parties, including the Party of the Regions, which at that time was clearly in favor of Crimea remaining part of Ukraine, who won most of the votes back in 2010. So all this time, we could see there was a potential for Russia to attack again in future. Now, many experts said, why would Russia attack Ukraine? They would be crazy to do that. The Ukrainians are broadly pro-Russian. They're very friendly towards Russia. They're not posing any kind of threat to Russia. If Russia were to attack, it would create a very anti-Russian Ukraine. Plus, of course, they would be killing their Slavic brothers if they were to launch an attack on Ukraine. So many people thought it made no sense for Russia to attack Ukraine. At the same time, that possibility was visible. And unfortunately, this also tells us a lot about possible future developments. Although it made no sense for Russia to attack Ukraine, they did it anyway. And when we hear about other scenarios, for example, would Russia attack a NATO country, or would Russia do something else that's completely crazy, we have to bear in mind that although it is not in the interests of the Russian people for Russia to attack Ukraine, or for Russia to attack another NATO country, or for Russia to attack Kazakhstan or somewhere else, it might be in the interests of President Putin, because of course this war is all about President Putin trying to maintain his personal position in Russia. It's nothing to do with the interests of the Russian people. It's simply about President Putin, who is afraid of the democracy that Ukraine represents. And of course, up until about 2013, Russia was completely relaxed about Ukraine and the European Union. It wasn't until the Bolotnaya protests in Russia, which took place from 2011 to 2013, that Russia suddenly reversed that policy I was talking about earlier of being quite relaxed about whether Ukraine got closer to the European Union or not. And after the Bolotnaya protests in Russia, which were mass protests on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other large cities against Putin, accusing him of stealing the elections in Russia, after those protests, suddenly Putin became very nervous about the development of democracy in Ukraine and about Ukraine getting closer to the European Union. And at that point, after those Bolotnaya protests in Moscow and St. Petersburg and elsewhere, he told President Yanukovych that he must not sign the accession agreement with the European Union. And so that is the origin of this war, is Putin's anxiety about the impact of democracy in Ukraine on Russia. And unfortunately, that means that Putin will do anything to stay in power. He's just worried that if he loses an election in Russia, his future will look very dark. And so he has to be very careful.
Mr. Turner, in one of your blogs on your website, you have a couple of very brilliant articles, blogs about the situation in Ukraine and about this war. You put very burning question, burning for Ukraine and maybe for Europe as well. Let me quote her. So, why does Russia's attack on Ukraine threaten your security, whether you live in Texas, Truro, or Tanzania? Here is the three reasons. And you give a very interesting three reasons. Please, could we just speak about that? Because I think it is very important right now.
Sure. Of course, nobody likes to see a war happening. The war that is happening in Ukraine, initiated by Russia in 2014 and then expanded in 2022, it's a terrible war. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians are being killed, along with thousands of Russian soldiers also being killed. And everybody around the world naturally thinks it would be wonderful to stop this war. We want the war to stop. That's reasonable, of course. The problem is that some people seem to think that if you stopped the war now and called a ceasefire, that would somehow solve the problem. And the reasons that it wouldn't are, as you say, threefold. The first reason why stopping the war now or having a ceasefire would not help is because it would not create stability. We've seen this before in 2014 when Russia attacked Ukraine in Crimea, in Donetsk, and in Luhansk. And then on the 18th of March 2014, they annexed Crimea. That's a territory roughly the size of Belgium. And before Ukraine fought Russia to a standstill in Donetsk and Luhansk, the Russians occupied roughly 7% of Ukraine. And for many years after 2014, there was a stalemate. There was a kind of ceasefire in the east of Ukraine, and Ukraine was not trying to get Crimea back militarily. And during that time, in those 8 years, 14,000 people were killed in Ukraine, 14,000 people from 2014 to 2022. And what happened after those 8 years? Did we get any kind of stability? Of course we didn't. After 8 years, Russia launched its new war of annihilation. And this tells us an important lesson, or teaches us an important lesson. What would happen if we had a ceasefire now in Ukraine, with Russia allowed to keep those areas that it has so far captured or annexed? That, by the way, is around 136,000 square kilometers. It's hard to imagine how big that is, but it's around the size of England or Louisiana. And that would just leave Putin and the Russian army waiting to launch their next attack. It would not in any way create stability. So that's the first reason why we shouldn't have a ceasefire now, or why stopping the war now would not be helpful, because it wouldn't create stability. And then the second reason is that if Russia is not stopped from winning this war, there is a risk that Russia would occupy the whole of Ukraine. And some people say, particularly some people in America, for example, say, well, so what? So what if Russia succeeds in occupying Ukraine? They would never attack NATO. All they want is Ukraine. Let's let them have it. That's what some people say. Now, obviously, if Russia were allowed to occupy the whole of Ukraine, that would cause appalling suffering and human rights abuses across the whole of Ukraine. That's a country roughly the size of France. In 2022, Russia was able to occupy Mariupol and Bucha and other Ukrainian cities. And when Ukrainian forces recaptured Bucha, we saw appalling human rights abuses had happened there. Now, clearly, President Putin uses all kinds of different arguments to try and justify his war. Even Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner mercenaries, said in 2023 that Putin's arguments for the war were not true. And if we allow Russia to win this war, Putin could use the same ridiculous arguments that were used to justify Russia's attack on Ukraine to invade many countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Georgia. These arguments, like, for example, this used to be Russian land, or this country is run by Nazis, or this country is threatening us, or this country is misleading its Russian-speaking minority. These are very flexible arguments you could use to justify invading almost anywhere, even if they are nonsense. And so if Russia were able to occupy the whole of Ukraine, it would lead to NATO and the United States having to spend far more of their military capacity to protect against a future Russian argument. And while a future Russian invasion, and while the argument that Russia would be crazy to attack NATO is true, Russia would be crazy to attack NATO, but it was crazy for Russia to attack Ukraine in 2014. It was crazy for Russia to attack Ukraine in 2022, and they did it in any case. You may have listened to the bizarre interview between President Putin and Tucker Carlson in February, where Putin said twice that Poland had collaborated with Nazi Germany in 1939. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. And this is very worrying. And then just finally, I've spoken for too long, but the third reason why Russia's invasion of Ukraine matters to countries as far away as the United States is that if Russia is able to annex 1 square inch of Ukraine, or even a little tiny corner of Crimea, then this opens a Pandora's box of future global conflicts. You will know, of course, that in the 1990s, Russia signed several international treaties in which it recognized Ukraine as a sovereign state within its internationally recognized boundaries, including Crimea. Now, Russia has invaded Ukraine and tried or attempted formally to annex by law this huge area, about a quarter of Ukraine, into Russian territory. It's trying to steal land from Ukraine. Now, if Russia is allowed to keep that land, it is a terrible precedent for aggressive countries around the world, everywhere around the world, to launch wars against their neighbors. Broadly speaking, since 1945, this has hardly ever happened anywhere in the world, that a country has invaded its neighbor and stolen its land. And of course, every country includes land that used to belong to somebody else. The land of which this is most true is Russia itself, which was a small territory back in the 16th century. As recently as 1958, the Treaty of Aigun ceded to Russia 598,000 square kilometers of Chinese territory. And then the 1860 Treaty of Beijing ceded a further 400,000 square kilometers. So those two treaties in the 19th century gave Russia an area of China that is roughly the size of Texas and Arizona combined, a huge area. So every country has bits of it that used to belong to something else. And the danger is that if Russia is allowed to succeed in its attempt to steal parts of Ukraine, other countries everywhere in the world will start doing that too. We've already seen it in South America, of all places, where suddenly Venezuela claimed a big area of Guyana, roughly 2/3 of Guyana, actually, which happens to be full of oil. And they said, well, you know, that in the 19th century, this was really our land. And this could set up a cascade of problems which would lead to immense future conflict around the world. So there you have it. 3 reasons why Russia threatening Ukraine is really a problem for global security. One is that it wouldn't create stability to stop the war now. The second is that Russia succeeding in its war would create enormous new costs and threats for the world. And the third is that we'd be opening up a Pandora's box of future conflicts.
Mr. Turner, you have a very good argument why we can stop war right now. But from another point of view, you say that if we think about possible future, we must remember that Russia and Putin is not rational in their experience. That is why. What's next? What can be done with this war? What is the future? And nevertheless, you put very interesting question in one of your blogs on your site. You ask, so how do we end this war?
Yes, I must say the situation that we are in right now, this is April 2024, is extremely difficult. We have, unfortunately, in the United States, the question of Ukraine, an important foreign policy question, has got tied up in domestic politics, which means that the United States is not providing as much military support to Ukraine as Ukraine needs. And this is tilting the battlefield in favor of Russia. So Russia has been doing very well in the last 5 or 6 months. This, of course, is storing up more problems for the United States itself in the future, as I've just been describing. I see really 3 ways forward, none of which are very encouraging. Well, only one of which is encouraging, really, from my point of view. One is that we will see some kind of collapse on the Russian side. We know that there are enormous tensions within Russia. Naturally, the mothers and fathers of all those poor Russian soldiers who are being slaughtered in Ukraine for no good reason apart from protecting President Putin, those parents could put pressure on the Kremlin to end the war. We've seen this before in 1989, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There's a little bit of hope there. There's also the possibility that other people in the Russian elite who can see that this war is absolutely pointless and is bleeding Russia dry, that those people will launch some kind of a takeover in Russia that would bring the war to an end. Although some people say anybody who took over from Putin would be just as bad, it's actually only Putin himself who is so closely identified with this war. And I think a new Russian leadership might have a different policy. But having said all that, of course, the structures of power in Russia are very strong and vertically integrated. And the present President Putin has had 20 years to try and make himself difficult to overthrow. So we really can't count on that. That would be my best option for Ukraine. Then there's the second option, which is that there's a collapse on the Ukrainian side. And all my friends tell me from Ukraine, this is very unlikely to happen. The Ukrainians are fighting like tigers and they're very strong and united. But of course, the war has been going on for 2 years. And that really creates pressure in Ukrainian society. Many Ukrainians, of course, would want the war to end. They don't want peace at any price. But we can't just assume that Ukraine will stay strong forever. So I don't think that's very likely, but we can't rule it out. So I think the third option probably is the most likely, which is that we will see a long, drawn-out war of attrition, where both sides make small gains at immense cost. This is terrible for Russia, and it's even worse for Ukraine, for the economy, for the people, for the whole country. It's a disaster, this long-term attritional war, particularly if Western countries such as the United States are not giving enough military support. What others should be doing, I mean, I think really we need to keep up military, political, and economic support to Ukraine in the medium to long term, for as long as it takes. And that's going to be difficult because, of course, as the months tick by, people forget this war. It's typical of what happens with any conflict around the world. We're seeing it even with the conflict between Israel and Gaza at the moment, that as the months tick by, people lose interest. They start thinking about other things. And so keeping up Western support for Ukraine from different countries in Europe and from the United States and from other countries that support Ukraine, such as Canada or Japan or Australia, keeping up that support in the long term will be difficult, but it's really, really important. And I've been pleased to see that countries of NATO, for example, are exploring how they can make sure that Ukraine has the military and economic support that they need.
Mr. Turner, do you give any chance for diplomacy, which is more usual for European countries?
I always think that diplomacy should be tried and should be given maximum space to succeed. It's really important that we keep open every diplomatic channel to try and end this war. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to see a negotiated outcome to this war that would satisfy both sides. On the Russian side, we have President Putin, who is very closely identified with this war. Without President Putin, we wouldn't be seeing this war at all. And he has to show the Russian people, he has to persuade the Russian people that this war has been worthwhile. So if he were to agree to ending the war, perhaps pulling back his forces out of Ukraine, pulling back Russian forces out of eastern Ukraine or out of Crimea, or even just pulling them back to the February 2022 borderlines, as Ukraine proposed back in 2022, any of those solutions would mean that Putin was finished as Russia's leader. So that those, he would have to justify why hundreds of thousands of Russians, as well as Ukrainians, have been killed and injured when they've gained nothing. So very difficult to see an outcome that Russia could accept in a negotiated diplomatic agreement. The same is true on the Ukrainian side. Ukraine has been fighting against this completely unprovoked invasion by Russia. It's lost its own hundreds of thousands of people killed and injured. Don't know the exact numbers, but it's very large numbers, probably less than the Russian casualties, but still very high. And for Ukraine to agree to an agreement that gave Russia some proportion of Donetsk or Luhansk, or that let Russia keep Crimea, is very hard to imagine. So to find a landing zone for a diplomatic agreement in between these two positions is extremely difficult. I do think that diplomacy should continue to work. We've seen some good diplomatic successes in the past. For example, the prisoner exchanges which have taken place between Russia and Ukraine. That's a good thing to have come out of diplomatic discussions. We saw the opening of the Black Sea grain channel for a while, thanks to an initiative, I think, by Turkey, which was a good thing while it lasted. So we need to keep these diplomatic channels open, but I'm afraid I'm quite pessimistic about the likelihood of finding a diplomatic solution at the moment.
Mr. Turner, many experts all over the world say constantly last time that it is a dramatic changes of the world. Rules, institutions, and other. You, like a diplomat with more than 40 years of diplomatic experience, do you agree with that? And what does it mean if it is true?
I do think, as I say in my book, actually, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and then the full-scale invasion in 2022 really turned diplomacy on its head. This is a completely new situation we're in. I've spoken to many representatives of countries in what's sometimes called the global south, who tend to argue that this is really a European problem, nothing to do with them. Countries such as India or Sri Lanka or South Africa or Brazil, they tend to say, well, you know, this is nothing to do with us. Why are people making this such a big deal? And I think the answer to that is, as I said earlier, that this is an unprecedented attempt by a country, and in particular by a large country, which is a member of the UN Security Council, permanent member of the UN Security Council, to take over a big proportion or perhaps the whole territory of a neighbor. This really doesn't happen. And if India were to try and occupy some or all of Sri Lanka, I'm sure Sri Lanka would feel very differently about it. Or if I mentioned Venezuela and Guyana, or if Peru were to try and take back some part of Brazil or vice versa, they certainly would see that this was very important. So the principles are really important. And just to give you one example, back in the 1990s, I think it was 1994, Ukraine, as part of an agreement with Russia, gave up the Soviet-era nuclear weapons which were on Ukrainian territory. Ukraine was actually the third largest nuclear power in the world when it came into existence as an independent country at the beginning of the 1990s. And Ukraine agreed to give up those Soviet-era weapons in return for a promise by Russia, also by the United Kingdom and the United States, that they would never invade Ukraine. So Russia gave Ukraine security guarantees in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. Now, you may argue that those nuclear weapons were Soviet weapons, they weren't under the control of Kiev, but I can guarantee you that if there were still nuclear weapons sitting in Ukraine, we wouldn't have President Putin constantly threatening to use his own nuclear weapons if the war does not go well for him. So the result of this, the result of Russia promising never to attack Ukraine and then attacking Ukraine, is that any country that borders on Russia is going to think, we need nuclear weapons. We need to have those nuclear weapons. And if we've got nuclear weapons, we're never going to give them up. And why do I mention this? Because it is a classic example of what you say, that this war has turned diplomatic practice upside down and has created an immensely more dangerous world that we live in. If I was living in Kazakhstan or in Uzbekistan or in Turkmenistan or Georgia or any country of the former Soviet Union, or if I was living in the Baltic states or in China, I would be extra worried after 2014 and after 2022 about what Russia intends. And we've seen this with China, interestingly. Before the war began in 2022 or resumed in 2022, Russia and China signed up to a new set of agreements, no limits agreements, where China would work very closely with Russia. But in fact, China has been very cautious in its support for Russia. It hasn't openly been providing weapons to Russia. It's offered to buy some gas from Russia at very cheap prices, so it's benefiting from that. But I don't believe that China actually welcomes this invasion of Ukraine. And I think China, as much as anybody, would be delighted if Russia would withdraw its forces and return Ukraine to its internationally recognized boundaries, which, by the way, were recognized by Russia itself in the Большой договор, the big treaty of, I think, 1997.
Mr. Turner, you know that we all in Ukraine remember how big is the role of Great Britain in this war in supporting of Ukraine. We remember very special initiatives from Great Britain in supporting about missiles, about tanks, and about other different things. And what do you think? What is the new role of Great Britain in this European security? Because we remember that after the Brexit, it was some period of rethinking, re-understanding in Britain about its role. And now how you understand, how you explain the role of Great Britain in this new, maybe newborn European security and maybe world security. We remember that Mr. Cameron will go to United States and he will have many meetings in White House, in Congress, to push the support of Ukraine.
The United Kingdom has been seeking to develop a good relationship, not only with Ukraine, but also with Russia since the early 2000s, when President Putin first became president of Russia. He was welcomed to the United Kingdom. He was seen as somebody with whom the UK and other countries could do business, and the UK sought to support Russia, as it did all the period after 1991, actually, with the so-called Know-How Fund and other means of providing financial and economic support to Russia. Unfortunately, since the poisoning of a journalist, Mr. Litvinenko, in the United Kingdom in the early 2000s, the United Kingdom has increasingly been very concerned about the developments inside Russia. Russia has taken an increasingly aggressive and destabilizing role, unfortunately. And that is why the United Kingdom has been really working hard to try and support Ukraine. It isn't that the UK is in any way anti-Russian. The UK, and I should emphasize, I don't speak for the United Kingdom. I'm not a diplomat anymore. I'm just a retired diplomat. But the UK has repeatedly tried to reset its relations with Moscow, including actually a visit by Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, which took place when he was Foreign Secretary, when he went to Moscow and met with Mr. Lavrov and others to try and rebuild the relationship. But the Russian response was this poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the United Kingdom by Russian agents. And of course, the invasion of Ukraine that we saw earlier in 2014, the shooting down of MH17, which the Malaysian airliner full of Dutch citizens, which tragically happened in 2014. All of these things has made the United Kingdom very concerned about Russia. So to some extent, the United Kingdom has taken quite a high-profile role in supporting Ukraine against Russian aggression. And I think that's a very good thing. You're right that, of course, the United Kingdom left the European Union on the 31st of January 2020, and that undoubtedly has handicapped the coordination of foreign policy between the United Kingdom and the European Union. At the same time, I think in the last couple of years, we have seen closer cooperation between the United Kingdom and the European Union in both foreign policy and defense. And we've just seen in the last few days a celebration of the Entente Cordiale between France and the United Kingdom. We've seen close links between the UK and Germany in terms of foreign policy. And I very much hope that a practical case-by-case cooperation between the United Kingdom and the European Union will now develop over the coming months and years to help them to coordinate their policies, including in trying to support Ukraine in this terrible war. You mentioned also David Cameron going to Washington. This is really important, and I agree completely with his goal, which is to explain to key figures in Washington, including former President Trump, who is one of the key people who is, as I understand it, preventing US military aid from reaching Ukraine. So Mr. Cameron, the British Foreign Secretary, will explain to former President Trump and to others in Washington why this war matters so much to the United States. Basically, the three reasons I set out earlier, because this war really has the potential to damage the security of the United States, and therefore the United States should be supporting Ukraine to make sure that Russia does not win.
And the last question, Mr. Turner, how popular in Great Britain, in United Kingdom, is the idea of big war with Russia? For example, if Russia, will invade for different countries, in Europe, for example, because it is very interesting words of ex-ministers of defense of Great Britain and James Heappey and Ben Wallace, who says that Britain now is not ready for a big war. It is very interesting. Is it really discussed in United Kingdom and Europe that such big war is possible? Does it mean that Russia became more powerful after this war with Ukraine? How you explain this?
I think the likelihood of Russia attacking anybody else after Ukraine is low. It's highly unlikely. However, as I said earlier, you can never rule it out. And before 2014, I think most countries of Western Europe, most countries of NATO would have said, Russia is not really a threat to us. The likelihood of a future war where we have actual conflict between Russia and NATO members is extremely low. But the fact that Russia has chosen, quite avoidably, to launch a major war against Ukraine certainly has set alarm bells ringing across Europe and across NATO. We've seen, for example, Sweden and Finland, which have been neutral for many decades, suddenly joining NATO because Russia looks so dangerous, so much more dangerous than it looked before. And it's clear to me that the United Kingdom and other countries of Western Europe really hate the idea of a war. They absolutely do not want to have conflict with Russia or indeed anyone else. Nobody likes wars, and a war with Russia would be an absolute calamity for the world. But the fact that Russia has attacked Ukraine has everybody very concerned about what other crazy, unnecessary wars President Putin's Russia might launch. So it certainly alarmed people. Doesn't mean that anybody wants that war, but it certainly is raising the ghost or the specter of a future war and is making people think we really need to prepare just in case.
Mr. Turner, thank you so much for your time, for interview. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.